start?
Yeah.
Yeah, sounds quiet out there.
Yeah, sounds quiet. Just out of curiosity, who's a foster or adopted parent? Love it. Love it, love it. And then who are the professionals? I know some of these are both, right? Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, awesome. So, do you want me to introduce myself first?
Yeah,
or
you do
go
you,
first?
and
Okay,
I'll
I'll do me. I'll do me. I know me, sort of. So I'm Sandra Flach. I'm a mom of 8, 5 through adoption. Our oldest was a kinship placement back in the olden days of 1999. And she didn't come through foster care. We took her before that happened, but we didn't know anything about trauma or FASD or anything. We just didn't know what we didn't know and thought we'll just treat her like our other kids and we're all going to live happily ever after. That doesn't usually work, but we thought that would work. But eventually we did go on to adopt a sibling set of 4 from Eastern Europe, from Ukraine. 3 came home first, and then a few years later, when we found out about the other one, the youngest one, we went over and we brought him home. And the second we met him, we knew we were in big trouble. We were not prepared, not equipped at all. When we brought his 3 older siblings home, for some amazing reason, they just clicked into our family with hardly a speed bump, other than like the language thing, which we worked through. But when this little guy came home, he was in the orphanage all 5 years of his life. I had done a little bit of research by then to know a little bit about attachment, and I knew a little bit about fetal alcohol syndrome, which when I read that was terrifying. And I thought, well, that's not gonna happen to us. And the first 3 didn't seem to have an issue with that. There were really no major problems. But this little guy came home and we just were so not prepared and highly suspected that probably prenatal exposure to alcohol, because we did know from court documents the parents were both alcoholics. So we assumed that was it, and eventually got the youngest one and his older brother. At the time they were 6 and 8, took them to a developmental pediatrician, and they both got diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. And that was great, but basically we were told you might want to focus on life skills, have a nice day. There were no resources, nothing. We were given nothing. So of course I went home and went online and looked up some stuff, because by this time it's 2011-ish. And it was very scary what I read. And I decided that's not going to happen to us either. And just started focusing it. By then I had read the Connected Child book. I had been to hear Dr. Karen Purvis in person. We were doing all the TBRI, Empowered to Connect stuff. All works, connected parenting stuff, absolutely. So that's what we threw ourselves into. We got trained as parent trainers, all of that. And it was working really great until they became teenagers. And then things started, the train comes off the track, so to speak. And I started realizing I know a lot of things about a lot of things. Attachment was great. All these other things are working great, but we're missing something. What is going on? And I suspected it was one thing I really didn't know anything about, which was the FASD. So I took a deep dive into learning everything I could. And by that time, there was more information out there. There were some podcasts, there was training available. And I just immersed myself in learning everything I could to help my kiddos. But then I started realizing nobody knows this. Like, nobody understands this. This is hardly ever diagnosed. Everybody needs to know. And I host a podcast called The Adoption and Foster Care Journey. And I began talking, it's not solely focused on FASD, but we talk about it a lot, because most of the time families just don't know. Or they'll hear that it's, my child was exposed to certain drugs or whatever, but nobody mentioned alcohol, but usually they go hand in hand, right? So that's kind of where I've come from being a parent and a professional in this space. And then along my journey, I met Rebecca Tillou.
Hello. So my name's Rebecca, and I am 43, and I was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome at 34 years old. And just to give you guys a little quick background, I was diagnosed by a pediatric geneticist at 34. And that just goes to show you that we have a long ways to go to get those trained that can diagnose us in New York State, among many other states. Like Sandra said, my parents adopted me out in New Jersey, but they got this piece of paper that said, Mom drank, and then in parentheses it said, but not an alcoholic. So in the 80s, they didn't know much about fetal alcohol, but the way they wrote that, I think they knew a little bit, saying, you know, if I say mom's an alcoholic, the chances of her getting adopted are going to go down, unfortunately. So once I got diagnosed, I became a self-advocate, and I'll go deeper into my story a little bit later on, but my struggles, they were academic, but I did very well in school. My struggles really reared their ugly head when I became a teenager. So around 16 to 18, all the wheels came off. So, but nobody knew why. So now that I'm diagnosed, my mom, dad, and I are like, oh, yeah, it makes sense now. So I'll go into a little more detail later, but yeah, that's the gist of it. So
I apologize about my voice. I have seasonal allergies, which yesterday decided to start taking my voice away, of course, right? So, all right, so just for a little bit of background here, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is actually not a diagnosis. It's an umbrella term, but the definition is a brain-based lifelong physical condition that affects the brain and body of those prenatally exposed in the womb to alcohol. And science tells us there is no safe amount of alcohol to consume during a pregnancy, no safe time in a pregnancy to consume it, and no safe type of alcohol. Because alcohol is toxic, it alters cells, it kills cells. It's a teratogen, right? So that's what's happening when a birth mom is consuming alcohol. I heard another speaker once say, if mom drinks, baby drinks. Jeff Noble has said that, and I thought that's a good way to think of this. And it literally affects and changes the structure and the function of the brain. This is a brain-based condition. So fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, these are the actual diagnoses from fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, neurodevelopmental partial alcohol exposure, all of which are caused by alcohol consumption in utero. Do you want to share your diagnosis?
Yes. So when I went to the genetic pediatrician, she took out like the DSM-5, DSM-5, and she looked at it, and then she measured my head, and I have a very small head size. And always have, I can wear my 11-year-old hats, and I share his sunglasses, and I have a very small mouth structure, which led to a lot of dental work when I was younger, and braces. All my baby teeth were removed, not all at once, but to make room for the adult teeth because my mouth was so small. So she did all this physical stuff, and then I have social stuff, social boundaries still difficult for me. I sometimes don't know where the line is. And also emotional stuff and academics. I did okay until college, and then it all fell apart because it's very abstract. So she diagnosed me with fetal alcohol syndrome. I do have the facial features. If I showed you infant photos of me, you would be like, oh yeah, wow. As I get older, a lot of us that have the facial features, they dissipate a little bit, sometimes all the way. But I do have a flat philtrum or top lip, and then my eyes sometimes look far apart. It's because of the palpebral fissures. So the distance between both the side of the side. So yeah, so that's why I was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. So.
And my two teenage boys are diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome as well. So interestingly, there's not really been studies done on the long-term effects of prenatal alcohol exposure as individuals get into adulthood, but there has been one recent study that looked into co-concurring health conditions and disorders. And it was discovered through a scientific study that there are 428 comorbidities associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. So not that FASD causes these things, but individuals with an FASD are highly likely, more likely than the average person, to have a co-concurrent condition. Not easy for me to say. Do you want to share anything that you're dealing with?
Yeah, so ever since I was little, when I was in 2nd grade, I had my vision tested and I ended up needing glasses. I don't remember not being able to see well, but obviously I could. I am without contacts, glasses, I can't see. I can't see the big E. I got it right because it's the main letter they show on the board when I went there. So you knew the answer to that, and they're like, oh. So, but vision issues are a problem. And I did talk to eye doctor for my son, and I told him my mom drank when she was pregnant, so I don't think his eye issues are hereditary, and he's like, drinking has nothing to do with vision. I'm like, okay, well, so there's a lot of education piece there. Lots of tubes. I had tubes in my ears, chronic ear infections as an infant, chronic, well, once a month at least. I also, not to be gross, but as a baby, I had constipation, which we thought was due to all the medications I was on. I still struggle with that today. And literally 2 years ago, I put 2 and 2 together and I'm like, oh, so a lot of our gut issues, those of us with an FASD, a lot of us have gut issues. And it's most likely due to that. So yeah, lots of stuff.
Yeah. So my kiddos, both of my boys, when we adopted them, had crossed eyes and had to have surgery to correct that. My one son, who's now 19, we adopted him when he was 3. He had severe scoliosis, so the musculoskeletal part of this. His spine was literally like a corkscrew. And as he grew, it just continued to twist. So he had multiple surgeries. He has permanent rods, spinal fusion, all of the things. He's also at 19, he weighs like 90 pounds and is 5 foot tall, very tiny. I'm trying to think of what else Slava has, but the 17-year-old vision problems, that was him also. He had they ended up doing an MRI because they couldn't figure out what was going on because he wore glasses, but they thought maybe his vision was worsening. And what they discovered was the optic nerve in his left eye is smaller than a typical optic nerve and a little bit deformed. So the way the specialist said, she said, oh, it'll never get any better, but it'll never get any worse. And I didn't even say anything about FASD because she was not going to get it. He did go through a year of vision therapy because he was having a really hard time reading because he couldn't track. And I was trying to figure out what is going on. I was homeschooling him at the time because school wasn't working out, but we realized that's what it was. And they recommended a vision therapist. So he sees much better and he can read words off of a page now in sentences, but we had to go through that time of therapy. And he still wears glasses, but things like that. There's a lot of co-concurring health conditions. Obviously, I don't have all 428 there, but those are some of the common ones.
Asthma, Sandra, so there's that on the screen.
Oh, asthma probably would be a good one. Respiratory,
Yeah.
yep, all of that. So, it starts making sense if you're a parent or a caregiver when you are, hearing these things and starting to put the pieces together for sure. It's pretty amazing. So FASDs are invisible disabilities. You can't tell necessarily that someone has it by looking at them. We will get to the facial features that Rebecca mentioned, but that's a very low percentage of the population. Typically, it's only the behavioral symptoms that we see. Unless you know that there was alcohol consumption in utero, you won't necessarily know that an individual has it. And when you start looking at the primary symptoms and you start realizing, oh, because when I learned about this to help my youngest, I started realizing, oh, my daughter, and I have permission to share stories from my kiddos. My daughter, who came in at 8 as the kinship placement, who's now 32, she had all of those symptoms. But to me, they looked like defiance, oppositional stuff, disobedience, stuff I was issuing consequences for, right? Grounding and all of that. And now I look back at it and I'm like, oh my goodness, this poor child. She even said to me a while ago when we were learning, we were sharing some stuff, and she said, I think I have that. I'm like, but with her, what I learned was she came to us because her mom had cancer and had died. The father was never in the picture. Nobody knew where he was. She was being cared for by her maternal grandmother who had a lot of mental health issues. So we were trying to help them, the two of them together. And the more we helped, the more we realized this is a really bad situation for a child. So she came to live with us. But, you know, what I knew about her mom, not an alcoholic, you know, she was, she had a professional career, but she was in her 30s and had been told she couldn't get pregnant because of some health issues. So she was probably, I'm guessing, around 10 to 12 weeks pregnant before she realized, oh my gosh, this is what's going on. And just was drinking socially. And that's all it takes, socially, up until and then when she realized she was pregnant, she was like, you know, what's the best diapers? What's the best formula? What's the best hospital? Like she was all into being a first-time mom because she never thought she could be one, but yet unknowingly that had occurred. So, you know, it doesn't have to be, it's not necessarily, you know, like you mentioned, alcoholic parents,
Right, yeah.
you know. So here we go. So here are some statistics. 50% of pregnancies in the United States are unplanned, like I just explained with you about my daughter's birth mom. Also, this isn't up here, but I had learned a while back that during COVID, drinking among women in the United States increased by 40%. So, you know, we're going to just start seeing the results of that when it comes to, you know, children entering care and whatnot. 2 to 5% of US babies have an FASD, and it's really 1 in 20, which is more common. 1 in 20 school-age children. This is not the kids in foster care. This is just your average kiddo, school-age child in the United States. 1 in 20 prenatally exposed, higher rate than autism, but much less known, barely diagnosed, and not really understood.
Do those get mistaken a lot, autism and
Yeah.
fetal?
I don't have slides in this presentation. I do like a deep dive, and we actually go over overlapping diagnoses, because these are the kiddos that will have an alphabet soup of diagnoses, right? And they may be accurate, they may not be quite accurate, but most likely they come under the umbrella of an FASD. And really it doesn't matter. I shouldn't say it doesn't matter. You may or may not get a diagnosis, but how you learn to, just like with the connected parenting stuff, how you parent and work with that child by providing brain-based accommodations and starting to understand the brain and how their brain works differently, they can be successful, whether they get that diagnosis or not. And also that kind of approach, a brain-based approach, helps even a kiddo who actually does legitimately have autism or some other neurodevelopmental disability, because it's all focusing on the brain. So when it comes to kids in child welfare, 17 to 19 times more likely that a kiddo in the system will have been prenatally exposed. I use some stats from Minnesota because they're leaps and bounds ahead of most states in the country when it comes to this. They actually passed legislation and regulations. So when a kid actually comes into care in Minnesota, they are screened for an FASD. Brilliant, right? And FASD training is part of foster parent training classes. And that's not in New York, because I called OCFS to find out, like, and they're like, no, like, okay. So I use the numbers from Minnesota because they screen, they have that data. So it's 41% of children with FASD in Minnesota are in foster care. 86% of kiddos with FASD and child welfare are either undiagnosed or misdiagnosed.
I was going to say, as I went to a training a few years ago, and I remember the trainer saying that anytime the birth parent is a cocaine user, to always suspect there's excessive alcohol use, because it makes the cocaine high so much better.
Oh,
That was stuck in my mind.
And I would suspect, you know, this again is just me thinking, you know, alcohol is legal, very easily accessible, and often drug use and alcohol use go hand in hand, right? But practitioners don't often ask, did you drink alcohol? They may ask about the drugs, but they don't ask about the alcohol. So that's you know, an area where, and a lot of times they don't want to stigmatize. This is a big, huge problem. And if you have a kiddo with an FASD, you know this. Getting a diagnosis is very, very difficult. I've had a mom of a teenage son adopted through foster care, when she learned all of the symptoms, she went to her pediatrician and he goes, yeah, that's not a thing. You know, and then I have another mom who they adopted kids through the foster care system, 4-year-old twins. And, you know, I knew, like I could just tell by interacting with them and just because they have the facial features. So I just assumed they knew, but she ended up taking the little boy, one of the little boys to a developmental pediatrician who, because she met me for lunch crying, like, and she had this piece of paper. He drew out the facial features. He drew out all these symptoms. He like did this whole drawing on this piece of paper and gave it to her. And I said, oh, so he diagnosed. And she goes, no, he said, come back in a year. And I'm like,
Yeah.
go
It might
back,
go away, you
go
know.
back. And it's like, why?
It will not go.
There's no other way he's going to get the facial features like but they just don't, and it's not taught in medical school. So I've interviewed a couple of doctors on our podcast. So in New York City, Dr. Douglas Waite, anybody know Dr. Hughes with Bronx Care? Is that like the place? So he specializes, he's a pediatrician, specializes in FASD. And he said, I might have heard 10 minutes in a lecture in medical school about this. And then Dr. Chrissy Petrenko out of the University of Rochester, they have an FASD clinic. The only one in New York State. There's not even one in the city.
Or in the capital of New York.
Or in the capital region, if you want to do something about that. But Chrissy Petrenko said she read maybe a paragraph in medical school, and she's a young doctor, like she's a young doctor. So they're not, and I just wrote an article and I asked them to give me some quotes and things. And I said, why aren't doctors diagnosing this? And part of it is because they lack the education. They don't feel comfortable. They don't want to stigmatize the birth mom or the child by labeling them with this thing because it's a lifelong condition. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but this is often the frustrating part. You don't get a diagnosis, but even if you do get a diagnosis, it's not recognized as a developmental disability on the federal level or in New York State. So OPWDD doesn't even, you know, unless they have a very low IQ or some other diagnoses that would get them OPWDD. And because this is a spectrum, my 19-year-old, he had in his most recent neuropsych eval, he scored just high enough on his IQ to, he didn't qualify for OPWDD. While his younger brother, just 2 years younger, biological brother who's 17, his IQ is 55. So he's much more significantly impaired. And that's often common when they're siblings because mom usually drinks more as time goes on and things spiral downward. So my 2 older kids from the same family don't have symptoms. Well, one has some physical conditions that I start thinking she had some learning challenges. So I think maybe a little bit, but I didn't know enough back then to even think that that was a thing with her.
And IQ is usually more than likely we have an average to above average IQs. So the fact that OPWDD won't even do anything unless our IQ is low, like it just, we're trying.
Frustrating. We're trying to pass
change
policy on the federal level
things.
and
We
at the
missed
state
it by
level.
one vote last year.
We're working on that. So as Rebecca described the facial features, I don't want to cover up the pieces of my hair, my big hair head. These are the facial features that are associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. So Rebecca mentioned the flat, the smooth philtrum, that space here under the, between the bottom of the nose and the top of the upper lip, thin upper lip, usually underdeveloped jaw, small eye openings for the slits of the eyes, usually the small head circumference, that kind of thing. So if you see a kid with the facial features, you're like, oh yeah, because my boys have these facial features and they were both diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. The problem is oftentimes doctors, if they're willing to at least consider a diagnosis, they're not only looking for, but one of the big things they're looking for is the facial features. And it's only 10% of individuals with FASD will have the facial features because birth mom would had to have been drinking on days 15, 16, 17, and 18 of gestation for the facial features to be effective. If she was drinking not on those days, but all of the other days, it doesn't matter. The facial features will have already been developed. It has to be on those 4 or 5 days for the facial features to be effective. So it's 10% of the population. This is why it's an invisible disability because you can't tell somebody has it by just looking at them. There's no, symptoms. And if it's the facial features, they may get the diagnosis. The other thing that doctors are often wanting to go along with that is maternal admission of alcohol consumption. And as you guys know, in adoption and foster care, you're not likely to get that, right?
At the hospital, they do test your urine, but most people wouldn't have just drank alcohol, so it probably wouldn't show up even if they were testing to see, you know, the drugs maybe, but not the alcohol.
Right. The drugs may be in the system, but not the alcohol unless they had just,
I just want to add something. So I always thought that for the eyes, that it was that they were like a little slanted, you know, close together, but also a little slanted, but that's not.
No.
They appear further apart, and I think it's an optical illusion.
Yeah.
Sandra, I think there's still, even so, like with my daughter's kiddos, there was hospitalizations from pancreatitis that they knew that she was drinking during the pregnancy, right? So it was black and white on paper. There was still hesitation, even though the child was in the hospital, even though the child wasn't gaining weight, even though the child, like, there were still doctors that were hesitant to say, it's too early for us to diagnose that. And it's like, so it's hard, it's frustrating.
It's frustrating across the board. I just was working with another mom whose teenage son, she's pretty confident has it. The same one whose pediatrician said, yeah, that wasn't a thing. So she couldn't get a diagnosis, having problems in school. She went to an IEP meeting because she felt like they weren't following the IEP. So she had me on speakerphone. We had permission for me to be on there. And she was brought up at FASD, and I don't remember if it was the school psychologist or if it was the guidance counselor. Some guy was in there, and she brought up FASD, and he said, oh, does he have a diagnosis? And she said, no, I'm trying to get one, but it's hard. He goes, I've done my research. That only can be diagnosed at birth.
Okay, then.
So then I got to chime in very respectfully, but
That's awesome.
I just don't. Anyway, so yes. So these are the primary symptoms of a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. We're going to go down through them. You can see them: dysmaturity, sensory processing, nutrition problems, language and communication, slow processing pace, learning and memory, abstract thinking, executive functioning. So we'll just start at the top and break it down a little bit. Dysmaturity is when they cognitively, developmentally really act or behave much younger than their biological age, right? Bless you. Do you want to chime in with any of that?
Sure. So dysmaturity, it's usually half their age. So I'm 43 now, and it's as I've grown older, I've matured. But when I was 16, 17, 18, I was probably, I can't do math, that's another issue. I was like 8, 9, or 10. So the choices I made in high school, they weren't the best, especially with relationships and boyfriends and girlfriends. I didn't know boundaries. I got myself into very bad sexual situations, and dated a much older man because I didn't know. And at the time, my parents, they didn't know I had an FASD. I didn't know, and they thought of it as rebellion, defiance, and all that. Come to find out, my brain just wasn't working correctly, and that's very common with some of us with an FASD. You'll see the sometimes sexual promiscuity, and so but yeah. But as I've grown, now I'm probably around 23, and it's good. My kids love it, 11 and 15.
She's the fun mom.
I'm the fun mom. That makes sense.
So with the dysmaturity, the way we've been dealing with that at our house is my 19-year-old, when he was in school, he went to a BOCES program. He could weld. He was very hands-on, could build anything, weld anything. The problem was when he was 18, socially, he was more like 10. So he was in an environment with all of these older kids, very, very easily influenced. And because he was a tiny guy, he wanted to be the big guy, the big man on campus, so to speak. So he got into a little bit of, he'd never been in trouble ever before. But that year, he, with a couple boys in the class, introduced him to vaping, then introduced him to weed. We pulled him out of the program because by then I had been learning a lot about FASD. And I'm like, wait a minute, we wouldn't send a 10-year-old to this program.
Right.
So now my 17-year-old, that's kind of one of my rules with the school is he's not going into a program where there are, peers his own age, because he cannot navigate that. It just leads to a lot of trouble. So that's often a big challenge, is that dysmaturity piece. sensory processing, you guys, oh, did you have your hand
Yeah,
up?
I wanted to ask, looking at that, because I have a 13-year-old and there's some things that's going on with him that I've seen, but they have him listed under ADHD.
Yeah,
Yeah.
almost every kiddo will have an ADHD diagnosis,
Is that a
mine included.
comorbidity? Is
So-
that one of the four things?
I don't know if it's it could be considered a comorbidity. It's just often because they don't know what else to diagnose.
So if I wanted to have him tested for this, like what I just asked, or
Are
like,
you in the city?
and please.
All right.
downtown.
Dr. Douglas Waite.
We'll get you his info. We'll get you his info.
Dr. Douglas Waite, Waite. He's with Bronx. There's a hospital in the Bronx, Bronx Health or something like that it's called.
Yeah.
But you don't have to, like, he'll even do telehealth calls, but he can
Yeah,
diagnose.
we'll get you his.
He's excellent.
Just talk a little more.
Sorry, okay, good thing to tell. Sensory processing, you may know a lot about that. These are the kiddos that are highly sensitive to that easily overstimulated with
Yeah.
light and sound and loud noises and that, or the tag in the back of their shirt or their socks, that kind of thing.
Their underwear or.
Yeah, or the opposite end of the spectrum, one of mine was on this all-out mission to experience every sense possible. He was the slamming, banging, crashing, like, he didn't like loud noises, but he was a loud noise. He is a loud noise. So sensory processing, and chime in if there's anything. you want. Okay. Nutrition problems, which can be, these are kiddos who often don't recognize they're hungry, or they don't recognize they're full, or they have a very unusual extreme craving for sugary foods and beverages. Like, I have one of my kiddos. Yeah, one of mine has, he's 19. He'll come out and he comes home from work because he does work. And he has to take a nap every day when he gets home from work. He might sleep through dinner and then he'll come out and say, did you make coffee?
Yeah.
Because he wants coffee that he can load sugar into. He didn't care about dinner. He just wants that. And now that he does drive and he goes to work and he comes home, usually with a big gigantic fountain drink of something terrible that he got, right? Because he would rather drink sugar than eat food.
And I'm pre-diabetic. Well, 1 point away, so I made some changes, but I'm older, so I made changes, but I crave sugar.
So I
Very
just wanna add, I have a family, that I work with, and their son got diagnosed with FASD maybe like 4 years ago. Well, a couple years ago, he got diabetes. And I remember the mom telling me like earlier this year that, she found that he had a whole can of frosting in that.
It's diabetes is a comorbidity, one of those
It is,
420.
And now I wanna talk to her about that,
Yeah.
Yeah, she's like, he has tons of food, and I tell him like.
They crave that sugar because alcohol is a sugar.
Yeah, yeah. And we were,
So language and communication problems, these are things like, Rebecca, you have a hard time with personal space. Reading body language. They may be able to repeat back to you something that you said, like, I told you to do this. They can repeat it back, but really have no idea what they were supposed to do.
multi-step directions, very hard.
Would you say as at toddler age, they maybe could speak very clearly, but it would be just repeating the wording? Because I have a little kid that just will,
Could be.
if you say, he's just repeating.
Our
what everyone
expressive
else is
language,
saying.
a lot of us, our expressive language is, it's amazing, incredible. And our receptive also, but I do very well at interviews. I can talk my way through anything, as you guys can see. But when I'm actually in a job, it's hard because we come across as knowing a lot of things. Our brains are sometimes very,
Slow processing pace is a huge one. And it really becomes more noticeable when they attend school because these are kiddos who cannot take notes. Like if a teacher is speaking and they need to hear something, they need to write it down, then the teacher's already going on to the next thing and they can't keep up because they're still processing information. They may very well, if you ask them something, they may answer with, I don't know,
we
Or
hear. every
what?
fifth word.
because they need a little bit of time and then they can come up with an answer. Yeah, like every third to every fifth word. So if you are like, I used to be a lecturer when you needed to issue some discipline, you have to give that 5 points lecture speech about why they shouldn't have done that. They're only catching every third word.
You know, took up our younger foster son was always, what'd you say?
Yeah.
What'd you
Yeah.
say? And we finally said, stop saying that. What did I say? And it would be kind of exactly what he said, but his first initial thing is, what did I say?
Yeah.
Because his
He
brain
needed that
finally
extra
figured out
time.
that his brain was just like still processing it.
Yep.
But he knew exactly, he heard everything
Yeah.
we said. but
Yeah.
For the first like 9
Or-
months he's been with us, for like, I said this.
So, and between the slow processing pace and learning and memory, if you give those a list of directions, like hang up your backpack, get a snack, you're gonna do your homework, and then you can go play. And then a few minutes later, you come into the room, what are they doing? Playing, because they only really caught the last thing you said.
Wow.
But then they're in trouble because they were not obeying and you told them what to do and they should know what to do. They're in trouble, but they were doing what you told them to do, but they didn't catch all those first things. So one step directions at a time are very, very helpful with these guys, but slow processing pace is a huge one. Learning and memory, they may know something one day and you know they know it, and 2 days later,
Oh, yeah.
they don't know it. They don't know.
I used to be able to ride this little Jeep around the yard. Last year when he got on it, he forgot totally. And he's been riding since he's 18 months old.
Yeah.
And he could not remember riding.
They can read a page, right? They're in like for a reading curriculum, they can read a page, turn the page, see some of the same words that they just read and not know what they are.
That's a lot with math with me. It was when I was younger. Word problems, I still hate them to this day. My kids love them. But if you have like 8 apples plus 3 apples equals 11 apples, but then the next is the same exact word problem, but there's oranges used instead. My poor father would sit there and be like, I don't understand how you don't know this. It's the same exact method of operation. I'm like, but they're oranges. Yeah, stuff like that.
They changed it.
Yeah.
So abstract thinking, this is managing money and time. Math is really hard for these guys. Very, very hard to do that. I have a kiddo who he graduated and he was working part-time, had money in his wallet, and I kept saying, you need to open a bank account. You can't carry all that cash with you. You have to open a bank account. He was like, no, the bank takes your money. So yes, they take your money, they keep it safe, and they'll give it to you whenever you want it. Because if you lose it, it's gone, and I'm not replacing it. Well, what happened? He lost his wallet. Very long story. Being someplace he wasn't supposed to be, but I won't even go there. But anyway, then as he got more money, I said, he had a graduation party. So some people gave him cash, some people gave him checks. So I said, we're going to the bank. We're opening up a bank account. My name is going to be on it. He's like, you're going to steal my money. Pretty sure I don't need your money, but here, we'll shred the debit card they issued me. I don't want your money, but here on your phone, there's an app you can see all the time. So we go, we open up the account, we make the deposit, and he goes to the bank teller. So when I come down here to take money out, are you going to give me these checks back, or can I get cash for them? And she was like, so, but it's that abstract concept of how all of that works,
It's like a
right?
6 or 7-year-old. And my son struggled. He was 6 or 7 and didn't understand giving money and getting money back. And
And the symptoms varied like based on when the mother was drinking, when they were in utero.
Well, it's a spectrum. So not everybody's going to have every symptom. And some of these symptoms will look like other things, like trauma often has very similar symptoms, right? So it can be very overlapping and confusing, but what we're going to get into when we talk about accommodations and supporting them, no matter what the cause, will be very helpful.
So a lot of the things that you guys are listing, I have a stepson. So a lot of the things that you guys are describing, he was diagnosed with ADHD.
Mhm.
And slight dyslexia.
Mhm.
He's in 3rd grade. He reads like very difficult. It's very sad. He can't read, write, math is difficult. So I'm trying to figure out, obviously, mom, it is what it is, but I'm like wondering, okay, is it really ADHD or is it something? Because I don't see the physical,
And you might not, it's highly
but it's
likely
like,
you
how
won't.
do you determine if it's ADHD or if it's this?
without the confirmation from mom.
Right.
And I would just say one thing, the ADHD, it can be a hindrance to some of the learning, but if you work with them, these children usually can pick up a little bit. But if they have the fetal alcohol, then they really don't get it like that. And they're more stuck or whatever, like the one I have, he's gonna graduate this year, and he's barely reading on a second grade level. You see what I'm saying? And,
Yep.
and so,
That's my 17-year-old reads at a second grade level. Diagnosis is hard to get, but it's important because medication, for example, issued for somebody with ADD or ADHD has an adverse effect on somebody with FASD because it's a different part of the brain, and it actually, they have a harder time processing information, and it just kind of speeds up their brain and they can't keep up. So we've heard horrible stories about kiddos who were put on medication for that, and it was not the right diagnosis. They didn't have ADHD, it was FASD, and it was disastrous. So you want to, that's why it's important if you can find out history, if you can, if there's not facial features, there's highly likely not facial features, just trying to find out everything that you can, but then understanding that it might not be ADHD, but almost every kiddo, both of my boys have that diagnosis, and I'm like, that's just because they didn't know what else to put there.
What does the medication for the ADHD do to a kid?
So I heard a parent tell the story of their kiddo was put on, I don't know if it was Ritalin or one of the ADD medications, and they were sled riding down a hill that actually, and why they were on a hill that there was a road that crossed at the bottom, and the dad was at the bottom and the little girl was at the top, and there was a car or a truck coming, and he's like motioning to her, and she was like, and got on her sled and went, because in her brain she could get there sooner and the truck wouldn't be there. Like it just totally, she couldn't gauge it. Yes, she was fine. But the parent, it was a foster parent, and they actually wanted to like disrupt they were like, we can't do this. And what they discovered was it was the medication she was on. It can have an adverse effect. So that's one of the reasons why accurate diagnosis is important, because of medications, because of
That's
treatments
hard.
and things, but it's hard to get one for
Especially
sure.
if you can't get confirmation.
Yeah.
That's just gonna cause drama.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah,
I
it's
know.
hard. So executive functioning is the boss of the brain, right? In charge of so many things. And I like to break this down, but this is one of the big areas that's impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure. Organizing, planning, transitioning from one task to the next, from one place to the next. I have a kiddo who can't tolerate if there's a fire, like a fire drill at school. He has to know, he has to be told ahead of time, because that sudden, the bell rings and we have to go, he can't handle it. Goal setting. You can see where some of this is once they're in middle school and high school, these are things that it's assumed kiddos can do. And if they have a hard time with that, they're not going to be able to do it. Self-regulation, poor attention. So that's why they get that ADHD diagnosis. Short-term memory deficits. I've got a kiddo who can remember something from 2 years ago, but then can't remember that word on this page that they read, and then we turn the page and they don't know it.
Yes.
Or 10 years ago.
Or 10 years
Oh,
ago.
yeah. My detail for like 15, 20 years ago. And
Our school read a word, but can't turn around and write it down on a piece of paper.
no, yeah, it's
And that, because that's a different part of the brain. So the part of the brain, when you read something and then you have to think about it, another part of the brain. If you have to say it or repeat it or come up with an answer, that's another part of the brain. And writing it down is another part of the brain. And oftentimes these guys have the wiring, right, does not all connect. Exactly.
Quick question.
Yes.
I should have asked before. Which type of doctor or whatever diagnosis this? Is it a neurologist or a developmental pediatrician, or does it matter? I was just wondering,
A developmental pediatrician can, a neurologist can. The problem is like I said earlier, there was a developmental pediatrician and this poor mom with the twins. He's like, come back in a year.
I saw a neurologist and he came into the office and he goes, I Googled FASD before I came in. You don't have facial features. That's all I could do. And that was when I was 34, so like almost 10 years ago. So some of them know, some of them are on board, and a lot of them are just not educated.
We're seeing a behavioral pediatrician in Rochester, and it's about a year wait list just to get an appointment. Yeah.
But
I'm
you're,
a therapist in Rochester. I diagnose it all the time.
thank you.
Let me
Thank
get an
you.
appointment with you.
He's like, I'm nurse.
Do you know Dr. Christy Petrenko?
Yeah.
I love her.
Yeah.
I love her.
Yeah, we I send them sometimes there for some of their testing.
Well, that's amazing.
So
I
thank
do a
you.
lot of intervention.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, you have to dig and find because you're not necessarily going to get somebody. So, but don't take no for an answer and don't assume that they know because we've learned that they don't yet know. They need to know. And poor impulse control, which is probably something that drives us all really crazy. Any stories on that?
There's a lot. Amazon is like the worst enemy. So especially with like click button, I see something I want it even at 43 and I will get it. And then afterward, I'm like, oh, that I probably should have waited to buy. I have money issues too. Thank goodness I have a great husband. Impulse also plays a role when I was younger with the, I'll say it again, with the sexual promiscuity and just making bad decisions and then being like, oh, that wasn't a good decision. So yeah. Yep.
No, it's a huge
What
one.
about like obsessions?
Oh,
Perseveration's a
Yes.
great one. But that works in my favor for my job. I can get into that a little bit.
yeah. So perseveration is not on this list, but that is part of this. And I didn't know it had a name until I was listening to a podcast. They were talking about FASD. It might have been the interview where I found you.
I think so.
And they're talking about it and I'm like, wait, it has a name? Perseveration.
Yeah.
So they get hyper fixated on something and can drive a parent crazy. So like when my boys figured out we save some money, we want to order, whatever, a walkie-talkies from Amazon.
Yep.
So, okay, we order them. Then you have to track it every minute of every day because you can track to see when it's coming. And one of my kids will wait out at our mailbox for the UPS man to come. And he came in one day that something was supposed to arrive on that day. And he was probably like 15 at the time, but again, you're talking like more like 8 or 9. It didn't come. And it was supposed to come by the US mail. So he came in, he said, I'm calling the post office. I'm like, that's not how this works. You can't just call the post office and tell them, just wait till tomorrow.
No.
He called the post office. And later that day, up our road, we live on a dead end road, up our road comes the mail truck. And I'm like, oh, see, our post, it was a lady, our mail lady, we always called her. She knew, like she had enough interaction. She came back with it. And I'm like, that doesn't really help because now he's going to think everything. But I dread when they're waiting for something, that's all it is. That's perseveration. It can be used for good, which Rebecca will talk about with her strengths. But for parents, it's like, oh my gosh, please, you're not allowed to talk about that anymore. I have to sometimes say, I need a brain break. So, let's see where we go next. All right. Okay, so we went over the primary symptoms. Remember these, right? Now, oftentimes we don't know that this is what's going on, right? We just have all these behavioral symptoms, super frustrated, not knowing what to do. Over time, because our kids actually have a disability, but it's not obvious, and we set expectations on them like we would any neurotypical kiddo. Over time, they become, how would you feel if you were visually impaired and you were expected to, do they write on blackboards anymore in the school? Whiteboards, blackboards, whatever board, the computer. If you were told you need to go work a math problem on the board, but you can't see it. And you're constantly told, just try harder. You could do it if you put your mind to it. If you put a little more effort in, you could do it, right? How would you feel? Frustrated, right? Irritated.
Because you want to, you know how, but you don't have.
But you can't.
You can't.
It's not that you won't see the board.
It's that you can't.
You can't see the board. So over time, if our primary symptoms are not adequately understood and accommodated, secondary symptoms can occur, right? Easily fatigued. Like I mentioned, I have a 19-year-old who goes to work, comes home and has to take a nap before he can do anything else because it's exhausting for his brain to work all day long.
I sleep 12, I have to sleep 11 to 12 hours a day. It doesn't happen, obviously, but otherwise I'm exhausted. Our brains work very hard.
A lot of fatigue, a lot of anxiety. I have a kiddo who has a really hard time if we're going in the car somewhere and I have to use the GPS because he cannot handle the fact that we might not know where we're going because he needs to know where we're going. Pardon?
No, I was just saying, all my kids are.
Nobody trusts you.
Right, these are These are not exclusive to FASD,
no.
right? They're not exclusive to FASD, but if you're, and this is kind of where parents are and caregivers are sometimes, and you're like, what is going on? We need to fix these behaviors, right? We don't want a kid who is, got school problems, they're depressed, they're argumentative, they're anxious and frustrated and acting out and melting down, right? We want to fix those behaviors, but maybe those behaviors are happening because they have an invisible disability that's not recognized, it's not accommodated, and they've reached this point of frustration because they cannot meet the expectations set upon them, right? Any of these apply to you?
Oh, no, you're good. No.
You're good. All right. So now over time, still, if there continues to be a chronic poor fit, the primary symptoms are not understood, they're not accommodated, this stuff is going on, but we're still expecting them to do whatever all their neurotypical peers are doing, it could lead to tertiary symptoms. These are not, secondary? Okay, tertiary. These are not automatic guaranteed end results, but these can happen. And sometimes with older teenagers and kiddos, you could see some of these things: criminal involvement, alcohol or drug use or addiction, social services involvement, legal system involvement. I read an article a while ago it had to do with FASD and the law, and it said something like the average age that a child becomes involved with the criminal justice system, a child with an FASD, 12.6 years old. 12.6 years old in the article. But you could, if you go back to some of those symptoms, impulse control problems, memory problems, perseveration problems, they can't really think through.
And they're like 6 years old in their mind, and they don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So we can get them into a lot of trouble. These don't have to happen if we can accommodate from the beginning and understand it and support the individual. We don't have to go here. And even the secondary symptoms, we can decrease these things or even prevent these things if we're accommodating accordingly. These are the brain domains affected by alcohol exposure in the womb. This is a little bit of review from where we were already, where they have a lot of problems in school with academics, focus and attention, thinking and reasoning. That's that higher functioning in the brain, the executive function, figuring out, oh, I shouldn't do this because that cause and effect, they can't think it through. Do you ever say, what were you thinking? Why would you do that? Right? They were thinking the way their brain works, right? Communication, memory, executive functioning, sensory, living and social skills, all these things are super, super hard. Anything there?
Nope.
Okay. So we need to be thinking brain, right? That's what we're going to do. We're going to think about the brain. We're going to start to look at the behavioral symptoms as maybe it's that my child won't, it's not that they won't do it, maybe they can't. How can we accommodate and support them? And we're going to focus on their strengths. So let's think of something like every parent would like to see their kid clean their room, right? We all have that expectation. So let's think about, what does anybody's brain have to do to clean a room? You can just shout out or raise your hand or.
What should I do first? What should I do first?
What should I do first?
Know where things belong.
Know where things belong. Somebody said organize.
Know that it's disorganized and recognize.
Recognize that it needs to be cleaned or that it's disorganized. Remember where to put it.
Well, to piggyback off that, the level of clean, so my level of clean may be different than other people.
That's a little abstract, right? Because we all know mama's clean is different than the teenagers.
Remember where you put things.
Remember where things go.
Process what you're being asked.
Process what you're being asked. Yeah.
Don't be distracted and don't break things in the process.
Don't be distracted. Don't break things, right? There's a lot of things that a brain has to do to be able to clean a room. Somebody did say plan, I think. You have to plan, right? Where do you start? Do you pick up the clothes off the floor first or do you vacuum first, right? Do I make the bed? Do I put away the dirty laundry? Do I, put the clean laundry in the, right? So planning, there's got to be that ability to plan. put things in order, right? Oh, the blocks go in this bin and the cars go in this bin. The socks go in this drawer. I hang up these shirts, right? There has to be an order to things. Spatial recognition. This comes in, I think, this was on here because one of the examples I've given in the past is we were teaching my 17-year-old son how to mow the lawn. And you have to be able to know, like, going around things, if there's a swing set or bushes or whatever. So, you know, that is a thing. Managing sensory, right? So if you tell them to clean the room and it's dinner time and you're in the kitchen cooking dinner and they're hungry and they can smell dinner cooking, no room is going to get cleaned right during that time. Filter distractions, because the sibling's going to come in, the cat or the dog is going to come in, or in the pile that they're supposed to be cleaning, they find that long lost toy or video game that they now have to sit on the floor and play with. And then you find them hours later, the room is not clean, but they're like playing with that thing that they found, right? Managing time, like, I have a son who'll go out for 5 minutes and swear that he mowed the lawn for an hour, but he was only really out there. I know, I've done it all day. Let's go
We
back.
have a little 4-year-old who we're in the process of the diagnosis process and the spatial awareness. Like, he'll just walk, the dog will be laying right in front of him. It's just like he walks through the dog. There's no like going around. There's no going over. It's just like, I will step on you if you are in front of me.
It's your problem to move, right? So I could click back, but if you can remember all of these things, and this is not an exhaustive list, there's lots of other things that you have to be able to do to be able to, I don't even think we have remember on here. So you have to remember where things go, right? Remember the steps and what you're supposed to do. There's a lot a brain has to do. And most of these things fall under the primary symptoms, especially executive functioning, right? So if you have a kiddo who was prenatally exposed, all of these steps and more are hard for them to be able to clean a room. And my daughter that we brought in as the kinship, I would send her to her room to clean her room, and I would literally find her in there an hour later, sitting on the floor, reading a book she found in the pile of stuff. And I always felt like she's defiant, she's disobedient, you're going to go to bed early tonight or whatever the thing is. And now I've come to learn, she couldn't, especially if the room is really a mess, she didn't know where to start. She did not know where to start. And it was overwhelming and she was easily distracted. So, it's very, very difficult. And this is a task everybody expects. If you're 12, you should be able to clean your room. If you're 15, with whatever, right, you should be able to do some of this stuff. So anything hard for you when it comes to cleaning?
Well, yeah, I get very overwhelmed. My house, I don't dust very often or anything like that. But with cleaning, I will start, or with anything, I'll start to do something, but then something will distract me. I will start cleaning my son's room, and then I'm like, oh, he left a cup here. Then I'll go downstairs, then I'll do the dishes. I'm like, oh, I need more soap. Then I'll go to the store. So nothing, sometimes nothing gets done. Like, there's just, but I know a lot of people are like that. So yeah. Yes, yeah.
Right.
It's gotten worse as I've gotten older. I hate to say that, but more demands that are placed on me, the harder it gets. I grew up in a very structured environment, so I did okay. But yeah.
And cooking is hard for you.
Oh my God. Yes. No, I don't cook. My husband loves to cook. I am blessed. I don't like to follow the directions, and then I need everything in its order, and it's very overwhelming. I'm not, it's too much. And shopping, I don't like to shop unless it's online. Yeah.
Unless it's Amazon.
And Amazon, I can do it. I'm going to a store with the bright lights and all the colors, and no,
Too much.
too much.
So
No.
what accommodations could we provide to the child to help them successfully clean their room? Pardon?
A list.
A list, a visual list. Is that on here? Well, the first thing we'll do is consider their developmental age. So you're right with the list. We're going to get to that, but always consider their developmental age with any expectation you're going to place upon them, because we just already discussed the fact that they're almost past their biological chronicle age. And we need to adjust our expectations. So if you have a 12-year-old, don't expect them to clean their room like a 12-year-old. Expect them to do what a 6-year-old can do. Roughly, it's not exactly always that, but Definitely always with any task, consider their developmental age, your best guess at what that can be. And it's not the same thing straight across the board, because you might have a kid who's very, very advanced and seems much older in certain areas. Like I have a kid who likes to weld and build, and he can do all these amazing things. But then there's areas like socially where he is much younger, right? So it's not straight across the board all the time. So it's a little bit like that. But always take that into consideration. Break it down into smaller steps, like one thing at a time. Instead of saying, I want you to clean your room, you gotta pick up these clothes, you gotta bring the dirty clothes out, you gotta vacuum the floor, you gotta make the bed, da, 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 da. They're not gonna hear all of that. We just learned that earlier, right? With the slower processing and the memory, one step at a time. I've got teenage boys, so this is where my standard has gone. Bring me out your dirty laundry. Just bring it out. Their laundry room's right outside their bedroom door, so just bring that out. When that's done, okay, bring me out your dirty dishes, because I have teenage boys. There are dirty dishes involved. Just bring those out. So just one step at a time, and that's usually how we're most successful. You could do a list if they're good at following a list. I have lists everywhere. My boys don't look at them because they're not visual learners. They're not even going to look at the list. Trust me, I know, because there's a big picture in our bathroom, a poster of flushing the toilet. It's there. It's over the toilet, and it's on the door when you leave the room. And still, when they come out of the room, I find myself going, flush, because I didn't hear it flush, because they don't. So if they're visual, that works great. If they're visual, you could clean their room for them, take pictures. This is what each thing looks like, and number them or letter them and hang them on a poster and just say, okay, today I want you to do like numbers 1 and 2 or whatever. If they're visual, if they're not visual, nothing's going to happen. Visual charts. See, I knew we were getting there somewhere. This would be like your list. If you have a kid who likes a list, some do, then that works great. My daughter, I used to try to give her like, here's your notebook, write all these things down. She could never find the notebook. Like it was like that kind of thing. So it only works if it's a strength that they have. One-on-one support. My 17-year-old can do lots of things, but he will not do them unless somebody is doing them with him. He is not self-directed. He needs a support person for everything. So, and then I have another kid who also has FAS, but he needs much less guidance with things like that. But, you know, in order for my younger son to actually get his room clean, he's my 8th kid. I don't want to spend a Saturday cleaning his room and co-cleaning, but my husband loves to do that. So he will go in and they'll work together, and my husband will guide him through, and he does a great job that way, but that's the only way it really gets done. So, you know, one-on-one support. And this is a great way too to build attachment, right? Build connection. If you make it fun, right? And it can be a great thing to do together. Consider their strengths. Always try to base what you're doing and build their strengths in. So if you have a kiddo who loves music, play some music while they're doing that. If they like to play games, make a game out of cleaning the room. If they're very social and they don't want to be in there alone, go in there and co-clean with them, right? Revise our expectations. Again, with everything that we ask or expect them to do, we need to revise our expectations and take into consideration their brain, their developmental age, and their primary symptoms, and factor those in. What helps you? Anything?
So yeah, no multi-step directions. And on weekends when nothing really has to be done, I get up, my kids come downstairs, my 11-year-old's like, can we do this, 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 and this today? And I get very angry. I don't yell, but I'll be like, I need a minute. I don't know. That was way too much for my brain. I figured that out probably 1 to 2 years ago, probably 2 years ago. So now even my husband knows, give me some time because my brain's not a big yet and I can't handle all of that. So I need little chunks given to me at a time. Yeah, and I am a visual person. My mom had a big calendar growing up with everything on it we needed to do. And that was my lifeline. And I just figured that out. That was, yeah. So
That's why you feel you did so well.
that's why, yeah, I was very structured.
Do you use a calendar now?
So I tried to use like 3 different calendars, but I ended up with just my Google one. It works very well, but I still want that big visual one, but I haven't found the perfect one yet. And I have to write in it, so.
Oh, wait.
Oh, I used to do stuff. My mom would get so angry. I lost so many pieces of clothing. I still remember the one sweater I lost with the elephant on it. I never found it, but I apparently lost a lot of stuff, and I never knew why she was so upset with me. My brain would just, yeah.
So now I'm definitely gonna look into this for him. Definitely.
Somebody over,
Thank
did,
you.
Angela, did you have your hand up or no? No, so,
So I do a lot with executive function. I just wanted to make the caution that these seem primarily the focus seems on executive function if it's broadly defined.
right.
And there can be other causes.
Yeah.
So this isn't the only cause. I think it
Right.
has a particular presentation. But lead, even cigarette smoking sometimes. Drugs were thought maybe not to be so bad by people like John Stossel. I think he was wrong. And pot has gotten a lot stronger. That's epidemic. Oxy, very strong.
Yeah.
So I think many paths to executive function, often alcohol is mixed with those.
Yep.
Not always, but executive function is an epidemic.
Mhm.
And alcohol is an epidemic.
Thank you. That's very, thank you for that. Absolutely.
All right, one question, and I just want to get through this before we go. I don't want to hold you up.
Burning question, is there one diagnostic test that every time we'll be able to say, like a neurological scan of the brain, would you know every time that that's FASD or no? Like, is there
No.
one? There's not.
There,
Okay.
I have seen scans, like there's a gentleman named Dr. Ira Chasnoff. He wrote a wonderful book called Guided Growth. And he shows some, so sometimes you can see it, but it's not always something that can just be screened that way. Focus on strengths. I went through that really fast, but I apologize. We'll be at the table if you want to have any questions, but focus on your child's strengths, build that in whenever you can, take into consideration their developmental level, age, and accommodate whatever you can do to help them be successful, right? I teach a whole course and take this way deep. If you're ever interested in that, I have information there, but these kids have a lot of strengths and a lot of talents. And if you can build on those, they already know what they're not good at.
Yeah.
Let's focus on what they're good at and build them up on that. There's some great books. Trying Differently Rather Than Harder is a book that a lot of the stuff I teach is based on. Guided Growth, I just mentioned Dr. Ira Chasnoff. Tenacity is Rebecca's book. She wrote a book about her whole story. Some great websites, facets.org. I'm a certified facilitator of the Facets Neurobehavioral Model. I touched on some of the elements of that today, and I take it way deeper in some of my other trainings. I have a podcast where I talk about this a lot. FASD Family Life and FASD Success are podcasts based out of Canada, which are solely focused on FASD, and I highly recommend, and they are excellent. We also have a support group my organization does. It's an online support group for parents and caregivers, whether or not your kiddo has been diagnosed. If you just think, oh, this could be it. We meet the first 3 Tuesday nights of every month. And there's information on this card, which we also have resources if you want to grab before you go out. And it also lists the books, the websites, and things like that on there. And then this was Q&A, which we're happy to do here or at the table. We have a table with all of our information on. Trainings coming up. Every month I do what we just did. I do as a free lunch and learn. It's different times every month. But I also have coming up next week a 3-hour deep dive. So it's taking what we just went over and then taking it deeper. And then I also have starting in June, this is also online. It's an 18-hour course. It's 6 3-hour sessions. We do give certificates of completion for all of our trainings. And if you are a licensed social worker in New York State, we offer CEUs. So these things are on there.
I did that and I was a big fan.
Yeah, so we offer a lot of every month, all the time. We have lots of things offered online, in person. I come to places to do training as well if you want it for your group or whatever. So talk to me at the table. There is brochures on the training, and it's all, fees are adjustable. It's a sliding scale. So I'm more interested in bringing training to people than anything else, but that's on there. So help yourself. We have a bunch of resources here and at the table. And thank you.